Hi again then guys, and welcome to of course another car review from GT Sport 1.53, and incidentally this is the last of the 4 initial car reviews before we get of course the safety cars beginning next week. So we're going to be moving into a bit of tuning for these first 4 cars before we review those as they drop in the mileage exchange. Now we are finishing with this one not because it's a bad car or anything like that, it's an iconic vehicle, and in fact many of today's hot hatches owe their lives to this in one way or another, and it is of course the Golf GTi, the original Mark I Golf. Now this was already in Gran Turismo, but it was not a premium, and you could really tell it was one of those very much so PS2 era looking cars. But the interesting thing about this one is the proportions now look totally different to what they were. It looks a lot chunkier, I think, especially from the back, than it used to in the franchise. And interestingly, although it's still fantastic in its own way, it doesn't necessarily feel as OP as it used to. And when I say overpowered, I don't literally mean overpowered, because the Golf was never like a 1000 horsepower hatchback or something like that. Well, this one wasn't. The HPA Golf was pretty good though. But what I mean is the handling, because the handling on that Mark I GTi, even as recently as GT6, was phenomenal. You could throw it through corners in a ridiculous way. It could literally like out-handle homologated Group B cars like the Delta and the Peugeot 205. It was insane. Now of course it's light and it's small, so it should be good, but it could cope with that kind of performance and that kind of power in a way that just didn't look or feel that convincing. It shouldn't handle or perform as well as it does. As I said, it's a great car, but it takes some serious overhauling to make a car like that handle and perform like an actual race car. And that is something which I like about what they've done with bringing this one back, because although it still feels great through corners for instance, you can definitely feel when you've got more power to cope with. And as you can see from a few corners in this event, you can definitely spin up the wheels because of the power. And that's exactly how it should be. The car should do that. Because at the end of the day, if even a modern, bright green 300 horsepower Ford Focus RS spins up its front wheels and is notorious for torque steer, well then of course a vintage hatchback from this point of view that's tuned up to like 280 horsepower, of course it should torque steer. It doesn't even matter what tyres you've got on, it should always do that, because it's ancient technology that's been pushed right up to 11 in terms of power. It's more than double the original power, almost 3 times. And it's still an old car, so no matter what you do to it in terms of the tyres and the suspension, you're still working with old technology, so it shouldn't suddenly feel like the best thing ever. It should feel appropriate to its age, and I like the fact that it does. And it's a similar way to how the muscle cars still feel very authentic, because again, in the past of the franchise, although muscle cars are always fun, and you can make them softer and wallowy, they would be kind of too good through corners. Something like a Chevy Nova from 1970 should not be capable of taking 500 performance point lobbies in the same way as like a Skyline. That's ridiculous. It shouldn't be capable of that. I mean, of course you can give it more power, but you're never going to change that car's inherent cornering regardless of the components that you fit to it, unless you do literally a complete overhaul of like a different chassis even and just put the body on top. Likewise with this, it does feel its age, it does feel authentic, and I love it for that. It's not a race car, it's not a touring car, it's not even a cup car, and it's certainly not a rally car, and it shouldn't feel like one. It should feel like what it is, an authentic, original, old-school hot hatch. And one of the things that actually stood out to me when I was looking at the specs of this car, which we'll get into in just a second, is something that of course I already knew, technically, but I didn't really know it, if you know what I mean. Something when you know it, but you don't really think about what that means. And what I'm talking about is the engine. This has a big engine. A 1.8 litre is pretty huge for a classic hatchback, especially one as small as a Mark I Golf. Back in the day, my old man had a Golf Mark I for a while, and it was tiny. It's one of the smallest cars I've ever been in, and the idea of having a 1.8 litre engine, I mean, regardless of the power, just that size is so big for its age and for a car like this. It actually surprises me that they went that big instead of like a 1.2 or a 1.4, because it would have still been good. Even a 1600 engine, as they would have called it back then, or a 1.6 in other words, that would have been more than enough, but no, they went all out to a 1.8. And to really put that into perspective, it's roughly the same size capacity as a 90s Honda Integra Type R. That's pretty big for a classic Golf. Now in terms of power, of course it's nowhere near a Type R Honda, 110 horsepower, actually a more impressive 111 pound-feet of torque. So again, of course it's going to torque steer. It's got so much torque already for a little car. And of course it's light. That goes without saying, 890 kilos. Obviously you can drop it even more. And the base category is obviously N100. Now you can actually tune this one up to N300, but I would definitely not recommend it, because although you can get it into that level with around 280 horses, that's not exactly prime N300. You really do need over 300 to fully compete, and unfortunately you cannot tune this car to that level. Now in N100, it's yet to be seen how OP this can be, because I have a little bit of an inkling that this might be kind of like the classic Mini, wherein the cornering, the handling, even the average speeds that you can do through corners on tracks like the Nordschleife could be fantastic, and it's actually what makes that classic Mini so good on the Nürburgring. And yet on a track where you just need straight line performance and power, it's rubbish. You can easily beat it with like a K car. I would not be at all surprised if this falls into a similar category. That remains to be seen though. I'll have to see what it can do with around 145 horses, but for this event I am running N200 against N300 AI cars, including some pretty impressive ones like the Countach. I believe there was a GT40 in this event if I recall correctly, so that's pretty hefty territory for even against the AI on a track as big and as iconic as the Nordschleife, or technically the 24-hour course. This car needs to be able to not just have great cornering, but to be pretty good on the straights. And the cool thing is you can see that in N200 at least, it is. Now, of course, in N200, it's no Mazda RX 500. And there are definitely cars that can beat it. I wouldn't recommend taking it up against like a Porsche 356 Speedster, or even the new 911 Carrera RS necessarily, but that doesn't mean that this car doesn't have a lot to offer. And one of the biggest advantages of a tiny car, as I've said before on the channel, is the simple fact that if it's physically smaller, chances are it's going to be more nimble and more maneuverable, and on the right track that can make all the difference. And I'm not just talking about, some hyper tight circuit like London or the kart space in GT6, but even something like Ascari, if that were in the game, or of course the Nordschleife. These tracks where, yes, they're fast, but they're deceptively tight and you need a high average speed not just on the straights, but through those corners. Monaco is another perfect example where I think this car would shine. Overall though, I think it's a fantastic addition. It's a fairly obvious one to bring back, but at the same time I wasn't absolutely sure that they would, because if I recall correctly we haven't had a huge amount of Volkswagens added. We've had, the Samba bus and the Beetle, I think that might be the only two. Those are the only two that I can remember at least. But yeah, it's certainly an iconic car. It's at least as iconic as those two for different reasons, and of course, why wouldn't you want this in the game? It's cool to see more N100 legends being added over time, because of course some of the most fun racing you can have is in the lower classes, because it's so competitive in a completely different way to like a Formula car or an LMP. With those, winners tend to win by a decent margin. Not all the time, but if you have the right car you can. Whereas in these lower levels, it really is about every single mile per hour and every single kilo advantage or horsepower advantage you can get. So ultimately that's it for my thoughts on the Golf. It feels authentic, it's good to see it back, and although I might not use it all the time, it's certainly a car which I will be going back to, if for nothing else, but to tune it up and see what it can do. But overall that's it for this review. Of course, tell me your thoughts on the car down below, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.